Hey, my name is Shelly. Let's talk about the books I read in January. I didn't really realize how much I read until I was making my pile for this video. And I read quite a bit, which I'm actually quite surprised about. One of them was kind of a carryover from last year, like December. And then a few of them were DNFs. So let's get the bad news out of the way and start with the DNFs. And the first being Onyx Storm. My lights are just not working with me today, so I got this beautiful deluxe edition and I DNF'd it. First things first, let's get this out of the way. I'm not the biggest fan of whatever this series is called. It's not called Fourth Wing, it's called Hyperion, I can't remember. So I'm not the biggest fan of this series. I can appreciate it. I think it's a lot of fun. I think that it's done something magical by introducing a whole bunch of new people into fantasy, which I can never complain about that. The more people who read fantasy, the better in my mind. But it is not my favorite. I feel like there's so many other series that have done it better. The first book, Fourth Wing, I DNF'd when it first came out, and then I reread it recently. I did a whole vlog about it. Loved it, had such a fun time with it because I listened to the graphic audio version of it. And then I read Iron Flame, also graphic audio, and I didn't have the best time with it, and I started to notice a couple things about it that I just really didn't like, but I pushed through and I still thought it was a pretty fun book. And then I picked up Onyx Storm. The graphic audio is not available yet. So I listened to the regular audiobook, and that audiobook narrator just does not work for me at all, at all. So I DNF'd it. I can't even remember at what chapter. I think it was chapter 15 or something. Couldn't deal with the way that the narrator just narrated certain voices and just kind of made them really angsty and too aggressive. She overacted some of these characters, and my eyes kept rolling, and I was just like, that was stupid. And so I decided to DNF it, and I think it's going to be a soft DNF, and maybe I will pick it back up when the graphic audio version is available to me. So that's probably not until spring. So that is a soft DNF. I don't know when I'm going to get to it. Second DNF. This is also another soft DNF. And that is The Throne of Broken Gods by Amber Nicole, and that is the second book in Gods and Monsters series. The first being the Book of Azrael, which was one of my favorites of last year. I absolutely loved it. I think it was one of those things where I picked it up at the time that I needed it. It was a perfect pickup. It was a perfect read for that time. I don't know what happened, but the second book, it was a really difficult book to get into. It took me a really long time to read it, and I only got to about 50% before I'm like, I can't do this book anymore. I'm not in the mood for it. There was a lot of things that I had a problem with. The first being that there was a lot of repetition and a lot of focus on the two main characters, especially the first main character, Diana. And I'm talking about every single character was talking about her or their relationship in the most inappropriate times too, when somebody's being tortured to death and that person being tortured is just oh, you have it so bad for them. And it's just really, in that sort of situation, I think that if you're dying and you're about to die, that's the last thing on your mind is somebody else's love life. So that just kept happening over and over again. And I was told that the first 200 pages were kind of like that, but then after that, it got better. And then I read past that, and it was still every single person, every single POV always talked about them. Any single conversation came back to Diana or their relationship. And I couldn't do it. So I had to soft DNF it. I'm not giving up on it because I did love Book of Azrael so much, but it is a soft DNF. And that's unfortunate and it makes me super sad. So let's talk about the books that I actually finished in January, and we're going to start with the ones that I like the least, work my way up to my favorites of the month. So let's talk about the first book that I kind of didn't like, and I ended up giving 3 stars, and that is Immortal by Su Lin Tang. I wish you could see this cover. My lights are not cooperating. It's so gorgeous and so shiny. I'll put it up here. I talked about this in a recent vlog, probably the last vlog that I did. I talked about it and my experience with it. I will be honest, since I finished that vlog, I don't really remember much about this book. I ended up giving it 3 stars or 3.5, and it was an okay read. So it has an audience, and I think that that audience is not me. This book is about a young human named Liang, and she is basically dying, and her grandfather uses this like special lotus seed flower and gives it to her to heal her, but it is taboo because it belongs to the immortals, which are basically like celestial beings high above, and in this world is very much Chinese inspired, so there's different, like there's the celestials slash immortals in one realm, and then the other realm is humans, and then I think there's another realm below. Liang's grandfather is like basically in charge of like, I guess he's like the guard of these immortals from the human realm. He's able to have access to these special things like the lotus seed. So he gives this lotus seed to his granddaughter, and then he dies. Like, this is not a spoiler, it's just right in the synopsis. He dies right away, and because he dies, she is now basically gets his position. So the attention is drawn to her, but she has a lot of things to learn, so she needs to go to the immortal court. So in order to get there, she needs an escort, and the god of war decides to escort her and take her through this journey to the immortal kingdom. And stuff ensues. What didn't work for me was the main character. I found that she was incredibly argumentative, combative, and anytime anybody said anything, she had to argue with them. And it got old real quick. And the second is that it was very insta-lovey between her and this god of war. Things do kind of change towards the end, but essentially it just didn't work for me. The other reason why it didn't work for me is because I watch a lot of Chinese fantasy dramas, so this was very familiar to me. This type of world was very familiar to me. Although this is done well and the writing is immaculate, the world building is just phenomenal, it's something I feel like I would appreciate more watching than reading. Okay, so the next one I also talked about in the same vlog that I mentioned before, and that is that I finally finished Wind and Truth by Brandon Sanderson, and I ended up giving it realistically 4 stars, but my enjoyment was more like 2.5, and I'm so bummed and depressed about that. I'm also going to put this down because it's shiny. So I can't really say much about the book because obviously it's the 5th in the series. I can say that the past few books, I would say in the last 5 years that Sanderson has written, I've noticed a certain change in his writing style. And although up until now I still enjoyed it, they weren't my favorite. They were nowhere near as the first 3 books in the Stormlight series and some of the standalones like Warbreaker. It just felt different to me, and this book in particular really, really felt different to me. I felt that the way that the structure of it, instead of doing parts, it was done in days. And I think a lot of people have talked about that, how it didn't really work for them, and also it didn't really work for me. I feel like it took a lot of the excitement away. And although there was like that dooming dread of like the clock ticking, it just, for what happened in the pages, it just didn't work. And I felt like a lot of the character arcs and the conclusions to their stories, just, they sizzled out. And it kind of made it like their journey up until this point had no impact on the actual story. Some of them did, obviously, but others, I was just like, oh, that's it? So it was very anticlimactic for me. The other thing is, I felt like, and I mentioned this again in my vlog, and I feel like I didn't really express myself properly. So I mentioned before in my vlog that I felt like Sanderson introduced a lot of things into this book as fan service, and that being the first one being the same-sex relationship. I love the representation, please, more of it. But I felt that the way that Sanderson did it was very surface level. I felt that he kind of introduced it because he felt like some people would appreciate it, but he didn't feel it. It didn't really reflect in the emotions of the characters, if that makes sense. So although I appreciated the representation, I just felt like my personal opinion that it wasn't done correctly. And the last little bit was, it was too long. It was such a long book. It really didn't need to be that long. I think it could have been cut out like maybe about 500 pages and still had the same impact. Maybe even more so because we didn't have to trudge through all that dream stuff. and some of the stupid humor because of all of that. And the conclusion wasn't as climactic as I thought it was going to be because, Sanderson, he's good at that. And he is amazing at worlds, and I do love the Stormlight world and all of the Cosmere. I love it. Like, it's amazing. But I think right now, it's not a favorite series anymore. It went from like my top to second favorite series, probably down to like 8. So it's unfortunate. I'm really, really bummed about that. And it's just the way it is. So now that that's over with, let's talk about something positive. I finished Foxglove by Adeline Grace. This is the second book in the Belladonna trilogy. This is a YA series, I would say gothic horror YA series, and honestly, it's one of the most adult YA series I've read in a very, very long time. Again, the lights, not loving books. Because it is the second book, I can't say much about it, but it is about a young orphan girl named Signa who has a interesting relationship with death, where death basically follows her around, and she's been moved from home to home to home, and finally she is at this new home and she feels like this is the place that she belongs. She's met some cousins who are her age, but because death does follow her, people die, and it's not good. And she gets wrapped up in some murder mysteries and some other supernatural stuff. And the creepiness is up here. It is a romantasy, so there is a romantic relationship. But honestly, even after the second book, I feel like that romantic relationship is not as impactful as her relationship with her cousin. I felt like that relationship, Signa and her cousin, and I'm blanking on her cousin's name, their relationship is what I go to read these books for, because I love how they started off as like almost they hated each other, to reluctant allies, to like people who love each other and are kind of still learning to trust each other. And that is the reason why I love it. I ended up giving this book about 4 stars. It wasn't quite 5, but I am really excited to continue on to Wisteria this month. So the next book I want to talk about is not... It would probably be at the bottom if I didn't continue on with it, but this first book was probably, I would say, about a 3-star book, and that is Glint by Raven Kennedy. This is probably one of the most beautiful hardcover books I own. I absolutely love it. It's so gorgeous. So this is a romantasy series of a retelling of like Midas, and basically our main character, Aaron, is Gold Touch. She is basically a living gold statue who is pretty much like the trophy, the like symbol of King Midas. And King Midas is the worst type of person ever. I hated his guts. Every single time he was on page, it was so bad. This first book was really difficult to get through because the representation of abusive relationship, Stockholm syndrome, like emotional abuse is just, it was really, really difficult. But if you're interested in this series, I do recommend checking out trigger warnings. I believe they're on the author's website. So yes, check out trigger warnings, and also know that the first chapter is very graphic, like steamy graphic, but kind of like not in a fun way. So just be aware of that. So the first book is not really a representation of the entire series. I feel like it's more like a prologue for you to understand what this character went through and how she got where she is. But I have to say that Raven Kennedy has the most addictive writing style I have read, like, for the longest time, probably since Twilight, back in the days when I was really addicted to that. The need to continue on after each chapter is unbelievable. Like, I binge read this book, I probably say in about 2 days, because I could not put it down. And that is crazy to me. The other reason why I really liked it was because I liked Arin's character. I think that she is actually a really awesome main POV, and that is saying a lot because a lot of the time in romantasy series, I do struggle with the female character. And she is awesome. She's funny, she's kind and caring, she's able to learn from her mistakes, and she's loyal, like very loyal. So for all those reasons, I did decide to continue on, and I read Glint, the second book, and oh shit. Gleam, and I have it somewhere. I mixed up the books. But anyways, I read Glint and then I read Gleam. So these two books. So I read the first 3 books in the series in January. I'm happy to report the second book, it does get better. The world building gets more vast. The characters develop more. There's less of the abusive relationship that is in the first book. And you're introduced to some pretty awesome secondary characters, including the male lead, who is also, I really like him. So the first book, I think I gave 3.25. The second book I gave 3.5. And the third book, Gleam, I gave 4 stars. So obviously the series is worth investing into if the books just get better and better. Now we are on to the last book of the month and my most favorite read of January, and that is Best Served Cold by Joe Abercrombie. So if you've been around for a while, you know that I picked up this book probably, I think in the summertime. And I decided to put it on hold because I wanted to buddy read it with a friend. But it just didn't work out. Schedules just couldn't align, and I really wanted to pick it up. So I messaged my friend and I said, hey, do you mind if I read this? And she said, go for it. So I did. If you are interested in Joe Abercrombie, I highly recommend the audiobook for sure. So I listened to the audiobook and I think I finished it in 2 days. Listen, guys, I love Joe Abercrombie. Like, I am obsessed with his writing. His stories are not like really something that I would be drawn towards. I will be perfectly honest, if it wasn't for Booktube, I would have never picked up Joe Abercrombie because it did not seem like anything that I would ever pick up. But there's something about Joe Abercrombie's writing style that I just absolutely adore. I don't care what these characters are doing. I don't care if they're going over battle strategy or just shooting the shit. I want to spend time with them. Although I did give this book 5 stars, I did feel that the middle kind of sagged a little bit. It dragged, and I did start getting a little bit bored, but it picked up towards the end, and oh my gosh, Joe Abercrombie really just knows how to pull at those emotional heartstrings. For those who don't know, this is a standalone in the First Law series and is following a character named Monza, and it is very much like a revenge story. Something happens in the beginning and Monza is basically left crippled and angry, and she basically spends all of her life energy to get revenge. This is very much like Kill Bill. If you like Kill Bill, please read this book, because Monza, like, I love Monza and I love the other main character, and I don't want to say who the other main character is because he is in the First Law series, so if you haven't got that far yet, I don't want to spoil anything. 5 star, so excited to continue on with the First Law. Those were all the books that I read in January. Yes, there were some disappointments, a lot of sad emotions on my part, but also there were a lot of fun times and new favorites and series that I'm really excited to continue on with. You can't go wrong with that. If you've made it to the end of the video and you don't really have anything to say, but you still want to comment, leave a coin for Best Served Cold. As always, thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, think about liking and subscribing, and I hope you have a fantastic day. Bye.